Welcome to an O'Connor Institute and Civics for Life conversation with Nathan Perl-Rosenthal. I'm Liam Julian, Director of Public Policy for the O'Connor Institute. Nathan Perl-Rosenthal is an historian of the 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world. He focuses on the political and cultural history of Europe and the Americas in the Age of Revolution, with particular attention to the transnational influences that shaped modern national politics. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University in 2011. He is the author of several books. His latest, which we'll be discussing today, is The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It, which the Wall Street Journal called, quote, a tremendous achievement that will shape scholarly and public debate for decades to come. Nathan, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congrats on that, on the nice words from the Wall Street Journal. That's big. And I was reading the New
Thank you.
Yorker the other day, and there you were in there as well with another nice review. So things are going well.
Yeah, it was a really nice surprise. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so I'd like to start by, you, as it's a work of history, of course, and so you're building on previous works of history that have come before. But you call out specifically two historians, R. Palmer and Eric Hobsbawm, right? And you say in your book that their works both influenced you, and also your book is in large part a reaction to their writing. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that, kind of maybe give our audience the lay of the land, as it were, of this sort of scholarship and what you're reacting to.
Sure. Well, what better way to start a conversation with an historian than asking us to do what we love most, which is talk about the history of ourselves, basically. Historians love historiography, as we call it. So Palmer, R.R. Palmer, he's actually my intellectual grandfather, who's my advisor's advisor. So I also have a kind of
Wow.
connection to him that way. Palmer and Hobsbawm are two very, very different historians who were writing almost simultaneously in the immediate post-World War II period. And this was a moment when there was a lot of reflection on how the world got to be the way it was. Reflection both about, from the point of view of someone like Palmer, who kind of came from a liberal, centrist, kind of left liberal world. Questions about where the sort of the rise of democracy had come from, how it was that there was this democratic alliance, NATO, to put it bluntly, in the West in the post-war period. And for someone like Hobsbawm, who was a convinced Marxist, actually remained a member of the party almost his entire life, as far as I know, but a really brilliant historian. The question was, well, how do you get this world divided into an Eastern and a Western bloc? And for both of them, the answer in part came back to this late 18th, early 19th century world, this age of revolutions. And so Palmer, who published his work, The Age of the Democratic Revolutions, in two volumes, 1959, 1964, basically said, look, there is a process that takes place at the end of the 18th century where kings are trying to kind of centralize their states. They're being resisted by aristocrats of various kinds, constituted bodies, he calls them, parliaments, things like that. And they're kind of, as they're locked in struggle, there's a democratic upsurge. There's kind of an opening for a democratic politics to emerge. And he argues that it's in this late 18th, early 19th century era that you see the beginning of Republican and democratic politics on a kind of Atlantic scale. And he sees this process happening all around the Atlantic world. Must be said, the North Atlantic world. He's really talking about Europe and North America, although it does have some applicability as well to South America. Hobsbawm has a completely different argument about what happens in this exact same period. For him, it's what he calls the dual revolution, and this is probably familiar to a lot of your listeners, the idea that there is a political revolution that takes place in France, which he sees as a bourgeois revolution, a revolution for property, right, to sort of create the conditions under which private property can thrive. it's what the English would probably call a liberal revolution, right? Their sense of liberal. And then there's, at the same time, the other revolution is the Industrial Revolution taking place as he sees it in England. And these dual revolutions, he argued, basically are the engine of the development of modern politics. So it's in response a little bit to those two books which are, they're amazing books. And I know I'm supposed to be trying to sell my own book, but, read Hobsbawm and Palmer also. They're just brilliant. Hobsbawm actually, especially. Palmer's frankly a little dull. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm writing sort of in response to them, but also, these are books that are now 70 years old.
Yep.
It's no critique of them really to say that things have happened, we've known new things, and it's time to revisit some of those questions that they raised.
Well, so tell us. I mean, what has happened, and what are you revisiting, and what have you found?
Yeah. So the thing that for me was challenging, and the thing that I think both, and that I really try to get at in the book, is how you get what I see as the mixed legacy of the Age of Revolutions, right? That I think it's not just that all the nice things about modern politics come out of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, because there is that tendency. When we think about the American Revolution, right? Well, just everything good comes out of it. It's like a font of goodness, and you see that in France too. I'm living in France for the year, and I have a lot of connections here, and I've spent a lot of time here, and there's definitely an idea here that kind of everything good in politics comes out of the French Revolution. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that it's not just the good stuff that comes out of this late 18th, early 19th century moment, but it's a lot of the bad stuff too, no matter how you define it. Authoritarianism, tendencies toward authoritarianism, right? The tyranny of majorities, various kinds of discrimination and exclusion. And one can go on and on. And that these are both sort of sides of this age of revolutions are rooted in this moment. So for Palmer, really the bad stuff from the age of revolutions is really just kind of encrusted sort of leftovers from the old regime mostly. It's this kind of, hierarchies and domination and, the sort of leftovers of the old regime that just couldn't get eliminated. And that's where all the bad stuff comes from. The good stuff is all revolutionary. I'm simplifying a little bit here, but not that much. For Hobsbawm, the story is a little bit more double-sided, because for him, the French Revolution is both, as it was for many Marxist historians in the 20th century, it's both the great engine of politics, the engine of history that kind of transforms, breaks down the old regime, shatters monarchies, shatters empires, right? But at the same time, it creates, in his view, the conditions for a kind of bourgeois individualism, the domination of private property, right? The kind of the world that Marxist intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century thought that they were, or hoped would be demolished.
Yep.
So the argument that I try to make in this book is basically that I don't think either of those is quite the right answer. It's not that the nasty stuff is external to revolutionary politics, and it's not that it's kind of the essence of revolutionary politics. The argument I try to make is a kind of developmental one, a processual one. Really that there's something in the way that politics is being organized, the actual process of political organizing during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that creates both radical power, creates new kinds of coalitions that are able to do new things politically, right? That are able to topple monarchs and, abolish slavery in certain places. But at the same time, that as you build these coalitions, coalition building is a messy process. It involves compromises. And the argument I try to make is that there are actually compromises that are kind of baked into modern politics by this revolutionary organizing. And then there's the generational dimension, which I can talk about as well. But that's sort of where I diverse from.
Well, so in your when we're talking about the age of revolutions, for you, you've got it 1760 to like
Yeah.
1825, 20. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now Palmer, he cuts it off, right, a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
What's the difference there? Why did
Much
you make?
earlier.
Yeah, why did you make? So Palmer's is only going up to what,
1800.
1800?
1800. 1800.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
you made a decision. Let's extend the age of revolutions. That's obviously deliberate.
Definitely.
Maybe tell us why.
Yeah. Well, I think it's hugely important. For one thing, so again, I hesitate to attack Palmer too vigorously because he's a truly, really great historian. but 1800 is a bit of a cop out, really. I mean, it's you get to end before Napoleon really comes to power. You get to end before Haiti turns into a monarchy and then an empire. You get to end before Haitian independence. You get to end without having to deal with any of the things that go on in Latin America. So it's a bit of a cop out, frankly. I think it lets him describe this as an age of democratic revolutions, which in a way, which if he had extended the chronology by 10 years, is just not very sustainable.
Okay.
And I think one of the great acquisitions of the past, especially 30 years of scholarship in this field, studies of the age of revolutions, has been that the stuff that happens after 1800 is really important, and it's integral, really, to thinking about what this whole era is about. And so I'll just name in particular the Haitian Revolution, which when Palmer, when Palmer was working on his books, the Haitian Revolution was not a part of the scholarly conversation, really, among historians of the Age of Revolutions. Probably could have been, but wasn't. And Latin America was, the scholarship on Latin America was still very walled off from scholarship on Europe and North America. One of the things that I think scholars have really shown convincingly is that we need to think about these, broadly speaking, the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic together, but also that we need to think about revolutions outside of North America and Europe altogether, and think about the ways in which they're dynamically related to each other and connected. So, and once you start moving past 1800, yeah, that was my feeling, was that you can't make Palmer's schema work anymore. You can't make it about the rise of democracy anymore. It has to be something more mixed.
I
It
see.
has to be something more ambivalent, if you will.
Is it possible that the what you call the cop out, is it possible that he has a different understanding of the word revolution,
Mhm.
in the sense of, for you, and you say very, very clearly in your book, you want to make clear, and you make the argument that revolution is a generational project. It's not this sort of the overthrow. That's not the revolution. To you, it's generational. Was it to Palmer? Was it also generational? And then he just kind of said 1800, we're going to stop, or was he just looking at the overthrow aspect?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say it's in the book that we're talking about here of Palmer's, The Age of the Democratic Revolution.
Yeah.
It is mostly it's about really about two things. It's about constitutions, and it's about um, kind of political ideas. And as far as political ideas and structures go, it I would buy his account. I
Okay.
mean, there's a funny moment. I mean, I mentioned this in the book. I sort of prod him a little bit. He describes this moment in Italy, sort of in the 1790s. The French armies, partly under Napoleon, conquer most of northern Italy and sort of set up these what are called sister republics, basically these kind of client states, essentially,
Mhm.
which are republican in structure. And Palmer describes them as being the high point of revolutionary democracy. And then he says, but of course, the people who were creating them had no contact with the actual masses. So that really tells you something about how he's assessing real democracy, right? It doesn't matter if there's an actual democratic public. It's the idea that matters for him.
Okay.
But I will say, just in his defense, I think that's about this particular book, or two volumes, because at the end of his career, Palmer. One of the interesting things about Palmer is that he at the end of his career wrote actually a sort of a life study of someone who went from being a kind of Jacobin to being a liberal under the Restoration. So I think he did but this is 20 something years or 20 years later, I think, maybe it's almost 30 years after he finished The Age of the Democratic Revolutions.
Yep.
So I don't know if it's Palmer's definition,
Okay.
if it's a definitional difference, but it's definitely a difference of opinion with that book. I think Palmer had a somewhat wider view of things, but yeah. But yes, the way I think about revolution is broad, and the political scientists are not going to like it. So if you're a political scientist and you're listening to this, you're not going to like the definition of revolution that I use. It's very, very broad. But I do that on purpose because I actually think that, and I've written about this, revolutionaries patriots in the late 18th and early 19th century actually think about revolution in incredibly capacious ways. They think practically everything as a revolution, including things that one would have a lot of difficulty now thinking of as revolution. But I think we need to take seriously the kind of usage, the way that they think about it, not just the way we think about it, right?
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned that the generational aspect of your work. Your book, you're kind of dividing the age of revolutions into two periods, two generations. Maybe you could talk us through that. Why you decided to do that? Why you find that to be so important?
Yeah. So the generational argument, I've been asked a number of times about this, and I wish I could claim that I was so far-sighted that I saw it the moment, I saw it from the beginning, and I just worked my way towards it. But it really emerged as I was doing the research. I was struck more and more by the homologies, by the similarities I was seeing between regions in a given period, and more by the difference that, let's say, 20 years made, right? Like I was struck by the ways in which the processes that you were seeing in the 1780s, let's say, in North America, which is at the end of the American Revolution, the beginning of the early Republic, then the Netherlands, which is in this period of sort of revolt, partly sparked by the American Revolution, which ends in a kind of Prussian invasion in 1787, the French pre-revolution. These different places seem to be going through, and then in Peru, actually, on the other sort of in the other hemisphere, in 1781 to 80, 81, 82, there's a series of uprisings, major uprisings, and I was struck by the homologies among all of those processes, even though they're taking place in very different places, and the ways in which they were similar to each other and different from what was happening in all of those places in, let's say, 1810 or 1815. So as I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, well, how do we explain this? Like, what's the explanation for why it looks so similar in across regions in a given period? And this kind of led me towards thinking about what's changing across all of these regions in a sort of coordinated and synchronic way. And one of the things that's changing is, there's an actual changing of generations, a kind of physical, right, disappearance of one generation and the appearance of another. And so basically the argument that I arrived at is that you have a real difference between the first generation of revolutionaries, the ones who were leading, let's say, revolutions in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the 1790s. So from, let's say, the early phases of the American Revolution, or the imperial crisis that leads to the revolution, through the late stages of the French Republic. A real difference between those people, the kind of John Adams, George Washington cohort, and the people who then become the major leaders after 1800, and the populations that you have after 1800. So the people who are the leaders in this first phase, before 1800, are really, they grow up in the old regime. They grow up in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, and they're imbued by what I take to be a kind of deeply hierarchical world. And we can talk more about that if you want. But the way I see the 18th century is as a deeply, deeply hierarchical world in which people are really stuck in place. It's not that there's no such thing as social mobility, but it's incredibly difficult to rise socially. And so people living in that world, especially if they're clever, they know they've got to stay, they know they're likely to stay in their social stratum. They're not going to, if they're born poor, they're going to stay poor. If they're born rich, they're going to stay rich, right? If they're born in the middle, they're likely to stay there. And so there's a kind of conservatism, a kind of um, uh, almost protectiveness, I would say, in a way, in a lot of the social strata, and a lot of separation between them, because there's not a lot of incentive to move or to socialize across these boundaries. And one of the things that the late 18th century revolutions do is they kind of break this all apart. They show, and in vivid color, right, that it's possible to move up and down, right, that kings can fall, that enslaved people can become, by 1804, emperors, right, in Haiti. And it's not that instantaneously everyone's like, everything's possible. But for someone who grows up in that world, they have a distinctly different way of looking at the world, a different worldview, and now I'm going to use a technical term, habitus. This is from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, a very important, really fascinating figure. basically a different way of looking at the world, a different way of understanding their place in the world that's much more dynamic, much more interested in whether you can move up, how you might move up, how you work with other people. And I think that difference actually allows, after 1800, the formation of mass movements, mass political movements in a way that hadn't been really possible before 1800. So that's the generational shift that see taking place here, which has, as I argue, pretty significant political repercussions about the kinds of politics that you can actually create. Um,
So, is part of this, because you talk about in your book, um, the early revolutions in your age of revolutions, the late 18th century revolutions, there being a difficulty to organize, even around the idea of revolution, because of these class stratifications.
yeah.
Can you give us some example? But at the same time, these
Mhm.
revolutions did happen.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so to
Yeah.
give us like how did they happen? I mean, if organizing was not something that was done, how did these revolutions get off the ground?
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, it's a tremendously difficult problem, I would say, for 18th century revolutionaries, because they know very well from, I don't know, from day one, but certainly day two, they know that as soon as there's resistance from an empire, a monarch, you need to organize at scale in order
Yeah.
to successfully get any kind of political change through, right? This is not beanbag. They really need force. And you see efforts continuously to sort of make this happen. And so let's, to take the American Revolution example, someone like Samuel Adams, for instance, is well aware. So Samuel Adams, who's one of the sort of the key leaders of the Patriot movement in Boston, starting from the mid 1760s onwards. So in the decade before the imperial crisis, the decade before American independence, he knows that in order to resist the power of the British Empire, he's got to have, a big movement behind him. And he does everything he can to try to organize a movement. And he's fairly successful at it from moment to moment.
Mhm.
There were sort of when the Stamp Act is passed in England, and they try to enforce it in the colonies. That's 1764, 65. Manages to get crowds into the street. When the Townshend Acts, so this is the next series of sort of tariffs and taxation that's put in place after the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1767, 68. Again, crowds in the street. But it's very punctual. It's really like he can mobilize a crowd, he can mobilize a series of crowds. He can't necessarily control them very well. And it
Okay.
kind of
Yep.
comes, it appears, and then it goes. Right? It's
Right.
not like there's kind of sustained mass organizing. And there's this famous moment from 1770 to 1772, which American historians have called the Quiet Period, because basically the British government doesn't do anything annoying for 2 years, and the American resistance movement just kind of collapses. And
Mhm.
you have these letters from Samuel Adams where he's like tearing his hair out because he can't do anything without this sort of external pressure. There's no there. And then as you get into the sort of the war years, it continues to be a problem that there's organizing among elites. And Samuel Adams is certainly a member of the elite. He's kind of rough and ready, but he comes from a sort of well-off family. And any of the revolutionaries, the name brand revolutionaries, right? Hancock, Samuel Adams, John Adams is a little bit of a limit case, but certainly part of that. Elbridge Gerry, you could go on and on. All these people come from well-off families. They're products of this very hierarchical mid-century world.
Mhm.
Um, and they're kind of able to organize themselves, but the organizing that's happening at the bottom is pretty much separate. It's pretty
Separate,
much
right?
happening on its own. And
Mhm.
so yeah, they're able to kind of work together from time to time. But the idea of a kind of systematic working together of what we would think as political organizing at scale over time, it just doesn't really exist in the North America of the 1770s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's really kind of, and the sort of centerpiece example of this is the Constitutional Convention. Now, I always feel slightly worried about talking about the Constitution in this way, but the Constitution is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for the Constitution. It's excellent. Thank God for the Constitution. But let's not forget that the Constitution is written by 50 some odd guys who basically decide that they don't like the way that it's not even 50, it's like 30 guys basically decide they don't like the way that the federal government is running, the national government is running. They convene a sort of private meeting and call on the states to send people. This is actually in the previous year in 1786. Not enough states come, and they're like, okay, we're going to meet again next year. They have a meeting. They get approval from the Continental Congress to basically edit the Constitution. They go in to, the room where it happens. They lock all the doors and windows. They take an oath not to share any information about what goes on there. They write a completely different constitution. They come out and they say, okay, now take it or leave it. And also, Congress doesn't get to vote, and neither do the people. We're actually going to have special conventions meet, which are going to be carefully stage managed, which are going to approve the Constitution. This is a coup. It's a coup. I mean, it's a very successful coup. It's probably all for the better, but nonetheless, I think we should call a spade a spade. I mean, this is a coup against the existing national government, which they have to do because basically they can't control
Right.
the popular governments of the states, and they can't kind of rally a kind of a world from below, more or less. They
Right.
don't have democratic majorities. Um, and yet
Interesting.
15 years later, it's a totally different story.
Well, yeah, tell us, I mean, how does this change with the second generation? What are
Yeah.
the implications?
Well, so I mean, the amazing example of this in the United States is the rise of the Republican Party, which starting in the Democratic Republican Party, which starts out as basically opponents of the Constitution, or sort of the loyal opposition, let's say, right, in the early 1790s. So the Constitution comes into force, is ratified in 1788, 1789 comes into force. The government is fully formed, and very quickly you have a kind of party that's not a party, a faction, let's say, that's kind of opposed to this newly empowered federal government. They gradually sort of coalesce around Madison and Jefferson, who they don't usually like to be called party leaders, but they become sort of faction leaders to party leaders. And what's amazing is by 1800, this starts in as early as 1795, really gets going in 1796, 97, 98. But by 1800, the Republican Party Democratic Republican Party has a national, sort of a robust-ish national organization. It has incredibly robust organizations at the state level, in Pennsylvania, in New York, even in some of the states like in New England. They're beginning to organize very sophisticated, sort of club and party organizations where you've got, a local party committee that reports to a district party committee, which reports to a state party committee, which is in communication. And what this produces is a party which actually unites constituencies which previously might have had common interests but rarely worked together in a systematic way. So you have basically Southern grandees, people like Jefferson and Madison, right? Southern plantation holders from the kind of elite. Small farmers, sort of smallholders in a number of different places, across up and down up and down the states, and urban artisans. Now, these are three groups which, it's not like they're all meeting together in person. What they've developed is a party organization which actually holds together over 25 years, basically, right? That is created in 1800 and until 1825 just wins every single election. That's how powerful it is. This coalition, which is across lines of class, across lines of, to a certain extent, across racial lines, although that's also interesting. It actually mostly is racially exclusive. But it's really a cross-class coalition, which is durable, which is organized in institutions, and it seems to come out of absolutely nowhere. And not coincidentally, the people who basically organize it are young men mostly, who grew up during the American Revolutionary era and after. So a lot of the key organizers are these men in their 30s, early 40s, starting around 1800, who kind of grew up in a world in which, the idea that Thomas Jefferson would be working with, essentially in a party with, Joe Schlemiel, the farmer, and, Joe Mechanic, no problem there, right? That's just fine.
Hmm.
Which 30 years earlier, even 20 years earlier, would have been kind of unthinkable. So that's
Yeah.
a really, and what's interesting is you see something similar happening in a lot of places. Can I give you one other example? This is my favorite example of
Yeah,
all.
please do.
Um, the first elections in Spanish America in 1812, 1813. So there's a new, basically, Napoleon invades Spain in 1808, topples the Spanish king, and there's a kind of crisis of sovereignty, crisis of authority in all of Spanish America for the next, well, basically for the next 20 years. But one of the first things that happens is that this group of Spanish, it's like an interesting group, but basically Spanish noblemen, liberals, various sort of Spanish officials meet in Cadiz in the south of Spain under British protection, and they write a new constitution for Spain, for the Spanish Empire, which is much more democratic in its implications than the older constitution, the older unwritten constitution. And they send this to Spanish America, and you have these first elections. So this is the first time they're having elections with, let's say, open to black men, native people, poor men. Everyone can participate. And immediately, like as if magically, they have party organizations. They have in Mexico something like 10,000 little, basically voting, what do you call them? Electoral tickets are distributed all throughout the city. So there's some way in which they don't need to be taught by someone else. It's intuitive to them that you work with the people who are at the top, who want to get elected to be, who are mostly, wealthy people who want to be elected to parliaments and things like that. They know immediately that they have to build party organization. They know how to do it. They're ready to work across these class and even racial lines. So there's some real sort of shift that's taken place. And again, I think it's really about having grown up in this late 18th century world where everything was just in motion. So it's a world in social motion, and people have a different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's interesting. Something else that in addition to the generational aspect that you make clear in your book, you talk about how you're not a revolutionary exceptionalist. I think is how you put it. And you sort of referenced this earlier about the French think everything great came out of the French Revolution, and the Americans think everything great came out of the American Revolution, and maybe the flip is that the Americans think everything awful came out of the French Revolution. So, why is it that you feel this way? That these, I guess, the idea being that these revolutions are much more similar than different in your view.
I think they're similar. I mean, I think there are more similarities. Let's say there are more similarities than we maybe like to admit. And I think it's not only that. Um, this is not only my reading of it, I would say this is also, there's been an accumulation of evidence over the past, let's say, 15, 20 years that's really showed, for instance, the degree of violence in the American Revolution. So there was a story that we used to tell about the American Revolution in that post-war period, that, the American Revolution was a nonviolent revolution. You still hear this sometimes, actually, in Congress.
Mhm.
Some of our less um, some of the less sharp tools in the box will, trot out the idea that, the American Revolution was a peaceful revolution. It was just like, waking up from a pleasant dream, which is just absolutely not true. I mean, it's just factually not true. That doesn't mean that it was bad, therefore, but it does mean that you have to reckon with the fact that there is a lot of violence built into the revolutionary moment. And conversely, right, the French Revolution, which, as you absolutely rightly say, and this has been the canard about the French Revolution since Edmund Burke, that it's this violent, crazy uprising of, basically of madmen. There's been a tremendous amount of scholarship that's shown that there are lots of people who are thinking very carefully about how to use violence, how to avoid violence, in the French Revolution, and that a lot of what's most transformational about it actually is not violent at all. Right?
Mhm.
It's really boring things like building roads, or redistributing land. Um, Uh, so I think it's partly that revolutions, my anti-exceptionalism, my resistance to the idea of exceptionalism, is partly that I see more connections than there are. But more than that, I guess I think that it's really important to recognize that each of these revolutionary movements, that they're connected to one another, and that none of them takes place in a vacuum, and that they bring different parts of sort of modern politics into play. That we can trace the genealogies of modern politics, of the things that we like, the things that we don't like, the
Mhm.
things that we wish to reinforce, the things that we wish to forget. That you can trace both in some sense back to each revolution in some part. And so I really would I think it's much better to think about the ways in which something like, if we want to talk about sovereignty, the sovereignty of the people, right? That this is an idea, yes, that is first encountered, let's say, in this period in the American Revolution, right? The idea of the sovereign people is first put forward um, in the American case. But it's the French case, it's the French revolutionaries who give it by far its strongest expression. Right, they're the ones who really push it to the limit, right? That the people are sovereign and total and all powerful in a sense, and in a sense, if you want to say, well, one way of reacting to that, what I just said is, well, and the American way is better, but
Yep.
part of the story of the Civil War, for instance, is the recognition that at a certain point, um, the sovereignty of the people can, let's say, overcome property rights. Right? Emancipation is basically the sovereign people declaring that slavery is no more, which is one way of thinking about that. Not the way I think about it, but it is a giant taking of property,
Yep.
and that's an assertion in the American context, if you will, of the sovereignty of the people, the sort of ultimate sovereignty of the people to make decisions,
Mhm.
even against the will of a minority in this case. So I think again, to be to recognize um, to recognize the other in a sense in
Yeah.
as we look at other revolutions, and to recognize the other not only as our enemy but also as our sibling in a sense, and to think about the ways in which you know there are there is a lot of transmission, there's a lot of interrelation here, and I haven't even talked about Spanish America yet, but for me, the moment that I just described to you, that there are probably there are literally two books with the title "The French Revolution and the Birth of Modern Democracy," and I think there are about six books with that title for the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution and the Birth of Modern Democracy. But the most democratic elections in the Age of Revolutions are in Spanish America. Those elections I was just talking about in 1812, 1813, those are the elections with the widest participation. They're the ones that look most like revolutions, the elections that we would have today, the
Mhm.
franchise that we would have today. They even
Mhm.
think about including women. So again, if we're asking about what are the origins of democracy, I think we have to talk about Spanish America, for instance. You can't just stick with, a kind of whatever familiar story about America and France. That it really is important to look beyond the familiar cases and think about the ways in which, even if everything doesn't turn out democratically for the next 200 years, that there's a real democratic story there, which has an influence in the United States, for instance.
Yep. Well, let me ask you that. I know there, a lot of our audience would probably object and say, no, no, the American Revolution was quite exceptional. Um, so let me ask you. I mean, are there ways in which you see it as the American Revolution as being exceptional? I guess it came first,
Mhm.
that might be one way, and but maybe there are others that you see.
Yeah. So I'm actually working on a new project, which is a book which is going to be published for 2026, the 250th anniversary of American independence, which is sort of a history of the 4th of July, sort of, but through 4th of July orations. And the thing of which there are thousands still surviving from the 19th century, and nobody's ever really kind of read them all. And just be grateful that I'm doing it and not you, because God, some of them are just terrible. A lot of them are, but many of them are fascinating. And one of the things that's most interesting about them is they use the word experiment a lot to talk about
Hmm.
the American Revolution, to talk about the United States. And that actually, I think, I don't yet quite have the goods on this, but
Okay.
I do think that's an exception. I don't think, like, French Republicans, neither in the 18th century nor in the 19th century, they never talk about the French Republic as an experiment.
Okay.
The French Republic is a thing. And I don't think Latin American revolutionaries do either, but I look forward to being told that I'm wrong. But that's actually, I think that's actually not only unusual, I think it's an exceptional quality of the American Revolution, but it actually has implications for the way that Americans are thinking about revolutionary politics even after the American Revolutionary War is over. I think actually that they think, if we take seriously the word experiment, that means basically a process, an ongoing process whose outcome is unknown. And I think actually one of the qualities of American politics in the early Republic and into the 19th century, maybe as late as the Civil War Reconstruction, is that Americans, even, pretty conservative ones, let's say, right? Even the people who are giving Fourth of July orations, who are not wild-eyed radicals by and large. I mean, these are congressmen, respectable, local dignitaries. Edward Everett, John Quincy Adams gives about 1 billion of them. These are heavyweights of their community. They really think the American Revolution's kind of ongoing, and we kind of don't know where it's going to stop, how it's going to end. And I do think that I think that's a bit of an American exception. I do think that that's something quite distinct. So I'm not averse to the idea that there are things which are distinctive about the American Revolution. Of course there
Hmm.
are.
Hmm.
There are things that are truly different about it, just as there are things that are different about any historical scene. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
No, I get.
The crucial thing, to my mind, is to pick is to settle on a real exception, and not a
Yeah.
what Mark Bloch called a kind of pseudo cause or a pseudo exception. Mark Bloch is a famous sort of the inventor of comparative history, actually,
Mm,
French
mm.
historian, who was murdered by the Nazis in 1944. Um, uh, yeah, and so he said, the reason to do comparative history is you avoid sort of false exceptionalism, pseudo causes, artificial pseudo causes, and I think I'm all open to the idea that there are things that are exceptional and important, but
Mhm.
I would want to be sure that they're really exceptional.
Sure.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's where I put my dime down on that.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I should say too, for our audience, we didn't really get to talk about this very much, but your book is there's a lot of narrative. You focus on individual people as you weave in the story of the age of revolution. Quickly, maybe you could tell us why did you choose to do that?
Well, so the book starts with John Adams, actually,
Yeah. Hmm.
and John and John Quincy Adams are kind of a typical example for me of these two generations. John Adams, who
Hmm.
grows up in the middle of the 18th century, and John Quincy, who at the age of 8 is watching the Battle of Bunker Hill, at which his family friend is murdered, and then 5 years later is in St. Petersburg on a diplomatic mission without his parents. I mean, it's he's got a crazy life, which habituates him to all sorts of mad things. I thought it was the reason why I really wanted to weave individual stories through, and so it's the Adamses. There's a Peruvian nun who, according to the Viceroy of Peru, was responsible for everything bad that happened in the Viceroyalty of Peru in the 1780s, and a lot of bad things happened then. So that's saying quite a lot. Anyway, also the namesake of the Basque pear,
Right.
a guy named Louis Augustin Bosque. Um, you know, One of the challenges of writing this kind of book, where you try to both cover a huge amount of ground, right? Because I try to do both Europe and North America and South America and a good part of the Caribbean, is the need to both summarize, encapsulate, generalize, but also, I'm an historian, not a political scientist or a sociologist. Like, for me, it's crucial that there be the kind of the taste, the
Mm.
smell, the
Mhm.
flavor of the place of these moments, and that you also have a place for contingency, for, someone woke up and they are having a bad day, and that's part of why things happen, or someone drops dead, and that's part of why things happen. And bringing individual lives in is a way of forcing the reader, forcing myself, and forcing the reader, I suppose, and sort of engaging both of us in the process of saying, well, we just don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where it's going to go. These are not impersonal forces at work. These are people, individual people who are trying to build coalitions, who are trying to navigate their way through the dangers, through the promise, through the possibilities of revolutionary politics. And I really wanted to have that kind of immediacy. So weaving these lives through was one of the ways that I tried to do that. Um, for the reader to tell whether it worked or not. But that was really the motivation for bringing those lives in.
Yeah, and I mean, well, and in addition to that, I mean, it certainly makes the narrative very very interesting. Have these real lives in there. The writing is fantastic. You did a great job with this. I know I can't imagine how difficult that is to condense not only this huge time period, but you're also looking at such varied places. But you did a great job, and it's a real achievement. Um,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
uh, Lastly, is there anything that I know this is a trite question, but um, what can we take away from this history for our politics today? I mean, is there anything there?
Um, I mean, I think there are at least two lessons. One, and really they're both about the generational dimension of revolutionary politics that I try to bring forward here. One is that I think one has to be patient if you want big things to change. I am not 17 anymore, but I remember how impatient I was as a 17-year-old to make things happen politically. I was in a little bit of sort of in politics a little bit, not professionally or anything, but I sort of dabbled, and you just wanted things to transform. You could see what was wrong. You wanted it to change. You wanted to make it better. And that's the energy comes from there, and it's so important in making politics happen. I mean, politics, for any of your listeners who've been involved in it, is just the most exhausting profession imaginable. It seems to me, and just constant go 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 go, and young people bring the energy that kind of that whole machine runs on.
Sure.
Although you wouldn't know it from the top of the tickets today, but anyway. But the energy certainly comes from the young people. But there's also an impatience that comes with that, and I really do think that one of the things that I felt I discovered in writing this book was that revolutionary change, bizarrely, doesn't happen overnight. It's actually something that develops slowly,
Yeah.
that takes time. And the other really was about coalition building and a kind of recognition. Let's call it a kind of humility.
Sure.
Um, that I think people who are engaged in revolutionary politics, and I think this is on the right or the left, because I think there absolutely is such a thing as right revolutionary politics. In fact, I would say right revolutionary politics has been quite a lot more successful over the past 20, 30 years than left revolutionary politics, has had much more of an effect on the United States. Um, that one has to have some humility, some self-awareness about what you're doing. I think there's a tendency to be self-righteous, to insist that only who belongs in your coalition. And I think
Right.
one of the things that I tried to show in this book is that people spent a lot of time doing that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, building coalitions by throwing people out, by trampling on other people, and the results are not pretty. You
Mm.
can't really, I think, build a coalition that produces change for the good if you're also engaged in a kind of exclusion. And again, I think that holds both for right and for left. Um, so I suppose those are two lessons. Whether anybody wants to hear lessons from an historian, I don't know, but
No, we all should. We all know the adage about repeating and et cetera, et cetera. So,
true.
um, well, it's a great book, and thank you so much for doing the work to write it, because it's so valuable for all of us
Thanks.
to have that.
Thanks.
It's a real service, and it's
Thank
it's
you.
really wonderful.
Mm.
Um, Nathan Perl-Rosenthal, thanks a lot for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much, Liam. This is great. I really appreciate it.